Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. Pride Month is right around the corner, so I'm wearing this very gay shirt and will be wearing many others just like it for the next few weeks because this is my first Pride Month being completely out of the closet, and I am absolutely going to make being queer my entire personality until July. Sorry, not sorry. It was a long and painful road for me to get here, and I fully intend to celebrate the ever-loving shit out of being hella queer. So you're gonna see a lot of rainbows over the next few weeks. Getting right into it for today, though, most of us are chronically online, myself included, so I'm riding on the assumption that if you're watching this, you've probably heard this commencement speech by Harrison Butker, who's like some sort of football guy, I guess. I'd never heard of him before this whole controversy blew up, but if for some reason you haven't seen this speech yet, lucky you, and you're about to see part of it. I'm sorry.
For the ladies present today, congratulations on an amazing accomplishment. You should be proud of all that you have achieved to this point in your young lives. I want to speak directly to you briefly because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now, about to cross this stage, and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world.
In his now infamous speech, Harrison Butker said,
I can tell you that my beautiful wife, Isabel, would be the first to say that her life truly started when she began living her vocation as a wife and as a mother. I'm on this stage today and able to be the man I am because I have a wife who leans into her vocation. I'm beyond blessed with the many talents God has given me, but it cannot be overstated that all of my success is made possible because a girl I met in band class back in middle school would convert to the faith, become my wife, and embrace one of the most important titles of all, homemaker.
The pure and burning rage that this speech brought forth in me spurred me on to get my rear in gear and make this video that I actually started researching a while ago, but haven't quite finished yet because life has been life and it be like that sometimes. I just couldn't pass up an opportunity to shove some science up the ass of this patriarchal douche canoe though, so here you go, another video. Echoing the sentiments of classically Abby in her now infamous video about how a woman's true calling is to be a mother.
Motherhood is a vocation worthy of respect, more than not motherhood. Okay? Unpopular opinion, I know, but I'm gonna say it anyway.
Predictably, Harrison Buttface received a standing ovation from the men in the audience, who were excited about his speech and no doubt carried his words out into the night to fuel and justify their own misogyny. But is it actually true? Is there good science to back up this idea that women are more naturally inclined to be good little housewives? Since men are supposedly more logical and fact-driven by nature, let's examine this idea rationally. Let's look at some actual real research that's been done on this very topic by some actual real academics with actual real credentials. Let's examine this idea in the cool light of reason in the way the menfolk will understand, shall we? What I want to talk about today is the whole idea of marriage and motherhood and why women are told basically from the cradle that we should be structuring our whole entire lives around achieving heterosexual romance and babies at the expense of literally everything else. Now, I've touched on this in like a bunch of my videos before. This is clearly a hill that I'm willing to die on because it's done a lot of damage to me and my life and also to like the women around me and their lives. And so I feel really passionately about this. So a lot of my videos do touch on this. So this video will be along those lines as well. So definitely go check out my other videos around this topic. I'll link to them below. But essentially this idea that like heterosexual romance and babies is the pinnacle of a woman's existence gets shoved down our throats pretty much from day one. But are married women with children really happier and more fulfilled than their single child-free sisters? The answer, as you may have guessed, is no. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a raging gay feminist. There is actually science to back this up, but I will get to that in a bit. Men and women drifting apart. A recent article published by The Economist detailed the many ways in which men and women are drifting apart, and this isn't just a Western phenomenon. It's happening all over the world, famously with movements like the 4B in South Korea, where women have been boycotting men and motherhood en masse, resulting in the world's lowest birth rates at the time of recording this video. Fertility rates are falling all over the world as a result of climate anxiety, tough economic times, but also a rise in feminist movements that have been spurred on by social media. For the first time in history, women everywhere are questioning the role that men play in our lives and how much we even want them to be a part of it. Predictably, as women are moving farther and farther left, both politically and socially, men have reacted by doing a hard right. And before you start to think that I'm blaming women for men's radicalization, the menfolk have a choice here. They always have had one. They could have chosen to examine their privilege, take a hard look at the ways in which they've benefited from the systems of oppression that women have lived under for centuries, and then done the hard work to unlearn patriarchy and do differently from their fathers and grandfathers. And to be fair, some of them have, but not enough of them, not nearly enough of them. It's easier to whine and complain about your rights being taken away, i.e. your privilege being taken away, and retreat into reactionary online spaces where misogyny abounds, and they can use their seething hatred of women to stroke each other's fragile egos. Anyway, I told myself this wasn't going to be a man-hating video, but honestly, Harrison, my guy, you are not making my job easy. How marriage is portrayed. For decades, pop culture and the media has portrayed marriage as being a goal for women, but a ball and chain for men. Already, we see the cracks appearing even at this still hypothetical stage. From almost day one, women are primed and encouraged to seek out heterosexual marriage as a sort of grand project for their lives, with all other goals and relationships coming in second to domestic life. Little girls are shown Disney movies about princes coming to their rescue and given dolls and play kitchens to train them for their implied roles as wives and mothers someday. Teenage girls are given rom-coms and novels about straight couples and encouraged to seek out grand romance. Adult women are heavily marketed to by a multi-billion-dollar wedding and baby industry and given books to read like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which we will get into later, and The Rules, and He's Just Not That Into You, to help them find a husband. Even the language we use around heterosexual courtship, like to catch a husband and to keep him, implies some sort of strategic antagonism that's inherently a part of straight culture and dating. Books like this support and uphold the idea that women are hardwired for connection, whereas men are hardwired for independence. This sets the stage for a race to the bottom where one partner, usually the woman, has to repress and sacrifice her own needs and authenticity in order to win over a man and not scare him away. This is a powerful and insidious cultural message that we all receive and have internalized to some extent. It's a big part of Compet, which I talked about in a previous video. I'll link to it below in case you haven't seen it yet. And it teaches women that we're inherently annoying to men and that if we want to be with one, we have to tone ourselves down a lot. Just an aside, one of the wildest things to me about dating a woman after like decades of dating men has been the way in which like I don't have to tone myself down. I can just be like as much as I want to be. I can be as big and as loud and as emotional and as expressive as I want to be. And she like eggs me on. Like she encourages it, and like that's wild to me because I spent my entire dating life up until now trying to tone myself down so that I don't scare men away, and like now not having to do that has been the most liberating, freeing, amazing, wonderful thing. And it's like one of my favorite things about being queer. But anyway, I will probably do a video about my coming out process at some point during Pride Month. I haven't decided like how much of that I want to share yet, and also like I'm still figuring things out myself, so I don't really know like what to say. But I mean, just like as a baseline comparison, dating women is so much more freeing. Like I didn't realize how small I had to make myself in order to be with men until I stopped being with men. Like it's wild, the difference. But anyways, I digress. So this idea that women have to tone ourselves down in order to be with men was at the heart of a lot of marriage advice from the 1950s and 60s, which I'll explore a little bit more in depth later on in this video. But essentially, for decades, women have been sold a bill of goods when it comes to marriage, and it's been shoved down our throats that it's this ultimate state of bliss from which we can obtain undying happiness, financial and emotional security, and social status. In The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, author Jane Ward explores a lot of antiquated marriage advice from the 20th century and argues that it explains a lot about why straight people struggle so much in relationships right now. She also shows how a desire for social validation through heterosexual marriage can be confused with a genuine desire for men, compet again, and how women were taught that submitting to a man is actually somehow a good thing. 1950s marriage education films offered straight women a mechanism to imagine that their conformity and submission had nothing to do with the patriarchal foundation of heterosexual marriage itself, but were instead individual acts of self-expression. By framing marriage and motherhood as a free choice that women could make, becoming a housewife was situated within a feminist framework. At face value, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that, right? Women should have the freedom to choose. After all, that's the whole point of feminism. Except not really, because first of all, feminism is about safety, equity, and intersectionality, not necessarily about choice. The whole idea of choice feminism is a huge topic that I don't have time to do justice to in this video, but basically it's problematic in a lot of ways. How much of a choice can something really be when your entire society and everything in your upbringing and every cultural message you've ever received is priming you to make that choice? At that point, it's not a choice at all. It's actually coercion. It's like saying that you always have a choice to quit your job if you're unhappy, except that you don't, because quitting would mean a loss of income, which would mean not being able to afford food or a roof over your head. So yes, technically you have a choice, except not really. Technically, straight women have a choice to not get married and have children or subscribe to traditional gender roles. But everything in our society tells them that by choosing to not do these things, they'll be missing out somehow. That by choosing to forego marriage, women will be bitter, lonely, and unfulfilled. We've all heard like the stereotypes about cat ladies. That by choosing to not have children, we'll be missing out on the greatest love a human being could ever know, blah, 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 blah. We've all heard that before. Single, child-free women know this. We have to face these prejudices every single day, not just from people in our lives and out there in the world, but internally as well. When you grow up with these kinds of messages, they get internalized and become that much harder to disentangle ourselves from. The idea that the highest possible happiness we could achieve is by creating our own heterosexual nuclear families gets shoved down our throats from birth because that's the institution upon which society rests, and we're expected to carry it forward. The history of the nuclear family. Way back in the year 1800, roughly 90% of Americans lived in what were called corporate families, which an article from a March 2020 issue of The Atlantic described as social units organized around a family business. These family businesses were things like dry goods stores, farms, plantations, and shops, and the social units consisted of parents and their kids, which often numbered upwards of 10, as well as grandparents, stray aunts and uncles, apprentices, and hired laborers. About 3/4 of Americans older than 65 lived with their kids and grandkids until the year 1850, when the demographics began to shift. Nuclear families did exist back then, but they were almost always surrounded by extended or corporate families. This was necessary in order to have access to the labor that technology now provides us, and it also acted as a kind of anarchic social safety net that protected the most vulnerable populations. These family units were resilient. If a parent died, there was an aunt or a cousin or an older sibling to step in. If a grandparent was sick, there was someone to look after them. There were more people to shoulder the burdens and to figure out how to navigate life's unexpected twists and turns. They were problematic in their own way, don't get me wrong. They can be exhausting, stifling, codependent, and lack privacy. I'm not here to romanticize the past. But the point I'm trying to make is that the nuclear family is a relatively recent invention and one that lacks the same kinds of shock absorbers that were present in these extended families and communities. In the 1950s, conditions were ideal for nuclear families to form. The Great Depression and then World War II had resulted in a shortage of housing and a decimation of families as many young men had been lost to the war. We talk a lot on social media about Gen X being latchkey kids, but during the war, there was also a whole generation of young people who basically had to raise themselves too, because their fathers were overseas fighting the Nazis and their mothers were working in factories and organizations to support themselves and the war effort. The post-war period was a reaction to this, and the idea that the all-American nuclear family was created in the 1950s as an ideal image of domesticity that young people could aspire to. People got married younger and the birth rate doubled, and around 13 million affordable new homes were built, which allowed white families to move to the suburbs en masse. Suburban life was marketed as a haven in a heartless world for adults and children who had experienced the ravages of the war, and for soldiers returning home who sought peace and stability.
so they join the stream of family life in the suburbs, soon to become part of its familiar sights, soon to absorb its familiar sounds.
The 1950s saw an economic boom that resulted in higher wages, lower prices, more manufacturing, and consumer goods. There was an uptick in church attendance, unionization, social trust, and mass prosperity as a result of policies that were designed to prioritize the proliferation of white middle-class families. Jobs were relatively easy to come by, and in 1961, the average American man was earning 400% more by the age of 25 than his father had before him. These conditions were ideal for the nuclear family to become the dominant institution in North American society. The standard structure of the nuclear family consisted of a male breadwinner, a wife who took care of all the childcare and household labor in exchange for a roof over her head, and the children they had together. Free time was more abundant thanks to the invention of household appliances, instant and boxed meals, and mass-produced clothing. All that free time was meant to be spent doing family activities, going on outings with the children, and eating meals together. For the first time in history, children were emotional rather than economic assets. I covered that in more detail in my video about pronatalism. I'll link that below as well in case you haven't seen it. And young girls were encouraged to prioritize marriage and motherhood over their education and careers. When tradwives on the internet romanticize the past and talk about a return to traditional gender roles, they're referring to this very specific, very unusual period in history. In reality, the nuclear family was a socially engineered project designed to weed out communism, bolster the economy, promote capitalism and white supremacy, and glorify the American dream. There was nothing natural and organic about it. It was a result of the intersection of public policy, economic reforms, corporate marketing, and Christian nationalism. And it was a prison for women. I talked about this at length in my video about tradwives, but basically, if you were a married woman in the 1950s and 60s, it was very hard to get a job because employers were reluctant to hire married women. Women couldn't open bank accounts of their own or have credit cards in their name, and they were completely dependent on their husbands for economic survival and social status. While men acquired property and advanced their careers, women supported and supplemented them by maintaining the property they acquired and by providing free labor at home that allowed the men to focus on their careers. Capitalism and the nuclear family. Women's unpaid labor was and is essential to the functioning of capitalism. In a nuclear family that relies heavily on traditional gender roles, women's labor saves time and money because in this kind of arrangement, women basically become free housekeepers, managers, personal assistants, early childhood educators, babysitters, cooks, drivers, house cleaners, therapists, and sex workers. We've all heard that Paloma song, Labor, that's been blowing up TikTok over the past year, and the lyrics are spot on. All day, every day, therapist, mother, maid, nymph then a virgin, nurse then a servant, just an appendage, live to attend him so that he never lifts a finger. 24/7 baby machine so he can live out his picket fence dreams. It's not an act of love if you make her, you make me do too much labor. A Marxist analysis of the nuclear family points out that this kind of structure performs an ideological function for capitalism by acting as a unit of consumption while teaching children a passive acceptance of hierarchy. It also serves as an institution through which the wealthy can pass down private property to their children, thereby reinforcing class division and inequality. Capitalism is based on a system of private ownership, and the entire foundation of the nuclear family rests on the ownership of property. It was made possible in the first place by the proliferation of affordable private homes that became available in the 1950s and 60s, and this was done by design. Levittown, New York went from being a potato field to a sprawling suburb in less than a decade thanks to revolutionary assembly line mass production of single-family homes that were marketed to white, aspiring middle-class families. These homes were relatively cheap, and they allowed young married couples to acquire property and assets, thereby granting them access to the bourgeoisie. The nuclear family was essential to the success of this project because it ensured that private property remained in the hands of the family unit and did not get redistributed among the masses. Government policies and tax laws supported and still do support this arrangement by protecting the rights of ownership and private property that directly benefit those who bought into the American dream. What this ultimately does, though, is reproduce inequality as property values go up, yet remain in the hands of the private families who own it. We're seeing the effects of this today, with housing now completely unaffordable for most young people. The only millennials and Gen Zers who are purchasing homes now are those whose families have have acquired enough generational wealth to be able to give them a leg up by helping out young couples with their down payments. Owning a home also requires a hefty investment in consumer goods and services that are required to maintain it. Washing machines and refrigerators must be purchased and maintained. Cars need to be bought because suburbs, for the most part, are not walkable in the same way big cities are, which is also by design, and insurance needs to be purchased for everything. Lawyers have to be consulted for making wills to bequeath all this property onto the next generation, and there's still all the furniture and interior decor and things that need to be bought to fill the home with. Just creating the environment in which to exist as a nuclear family is expensive and time-consuming and stressful. Who wouldn't rather be spending that time with loved ones or cultivating a hobby or a creative project? I truly do not understand the appeal of this suburbia thing. It just seems like such a waste of precious time and money for no good reason. But I digress. If that's your jam, then that's awesome. I'm not here to yuck anyone's yum. I'm just speaking personally here. Anyway, women's unpaid labor is essential to the functioning of this system of maintaining private property. We tend to think of workers as being only those who work outside the home, but in 2023, the OECD estimated that the value of women's unpaid domestic labor amounted to about 15% of the GDP on average across all OECD countries. That's an enormous amount of free, unrecognized, unappreciated labor. Domestic work is work. It both reproduces humans, which guarantees the continuity of the labor force, and it prepares and supports the workers in the home to go to work daily. Yet we still have this view as a society somehow that domestic work isn't real work. One of the first feminists to challenge this view was Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, who wrote in 1972 that the housewife and her labor was the basis for capital accumulation. Men directly benefit from having women in the home who are doing all this free work for them. Even if nowadays men do more household chores, women still shoulder the lion's share of the emotional and psychological labor, or the mental load, which I will expand more on later in this video. In an article from 2010 called Housework Under Capitalism, The Unpaid Labor of Mothers, author Cindy Lirondell wrote, "Women who provide all this free labor in a capitalist system in which nothing else is free must stop being so nice. It makes us tired. And the logical consequence of being too tired is no special extras in the home and no volunteering at the school. Perhaps all volunteers should stop working for free, as it is the logical consequence of living under a market-dominated value system. I find myself trying to comply with two incompatible demands by society. Number one, be a good mother, and number two, not be a leech and earn a living. So I do both in a compromised way." The moralization of women's domestic roles. In that article by Cindy Lirondell that I just quoted, she touches on the fact that women's labor in the home is moralized. Society views it as moral and good, and that it should be undertaken out of nothing but love and devotion for a woman's family. This is the old Protestant work ethic coming into play here, coercing us all to be productive, to toil endlessly for God and country, or for husband and children if you're a woman. Research has shown that women in heterosexual couples are consistently held to higher standards than men. They are more likely to be shamed for having a messy home or for not having perfectly dressed, perfectly well-behaved children. By contrast, men are praised for being good dads just for doing the barest of bare minimums. In her book entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, author Kate Mann writes that some women may not feel entitled to equitable domestic arrangements and leisure time for themselves on par with that of their husbands. Or they may feel entitled to this in theory, but unable to insist on it in reality, given the social forces around them that tell them not to insist and to take one for the team in perpetuity. Men, by and large, are not held to the same standards. The amount of domestic and childcare work that men do tends to be compared to that of their fathers and grandfathers rather than that of their wives and partners. In other words, modern men are praised for doing more than their fathers did, but they still fail to do their fair share in comparison to the women they live with, and women are still massively overburdened as a result of this. In Mann's book, she noticed that a lot of women in heterosexual couples struggle to recognize this, and even if they do, they may feel guilty about asking for more. She calls this himpathy, the disproportionate or inappropriate sympathy for a man who behaves in misogynistic or entitled ways over his female victims. others. This sense of empathy comes from internalizing our socially prescribed obligations to care for others at the expense of ourselves. This internalized sense of our own oppression is framed as morality, as something that women are expected to do because we are the gentler, more compassionate, and more caring sex. This comes from outdated and sexist views on women's roles in society as the pious keepers of morale, and even in our relatively progressive 21st century society, those ideas still hold strong. The gender ideology of the 1950s and 60s constructed femininity as being modest, caretaking, and concerned with domesticity and romantic love, whereas masculinity had more to do with autonomy, restrained lust, and emotional repression. Mid-century marriage manuals and self-help guides mainly focused on addressing the problem of women's annoying personalities, making it women's responsibility to emotionally care for their husbands and ensure that they don't infringe upon their autonomy too much. Dr. Edward Podolsky's 1947 book called Sex Today and Wedded Life, A Doctor's Confidential Advice, lists 10 commandments for wives to get them to cultivate their husband's love and affection and to keep their homes running smoothly. These commandments are: Number 1, don't bother your husband with petty troubles and complaints when he comes home from work. Number 2, be a good listener. Let him tell you his troubles. Yours will seem petty in comparison. Number 3, remember your most important job is to build up and maintain his ego, which gets bruised plenty in business. Morale is a woman's business. Number 4, let him relax after dinner and discuss family problems after the inner man has been satisfied. Number 5, always remember he's a male and marital relations promote harmony. Have sane views about sex. Number 6, no man likes a wife who is always tired out. Conserve your energy so you can give him the companionship he craves. Number 7, never hold up your husband to ridicule in the presence of others. If you must criticize, do so privately and without anger. Number 8, remember, a man is only a grown-up boy. He needs mothering and enjoys it if not piled on too thick. Number 9, don't live beyond your means or add to your husband's financial burdens. Number 10, don't try to boss him around. Let him think he wears the pants. Whew, I could barely get through that, you guys. A lot of marriage and relationship advice from the post-war period sounds like this. It's all directed at women and how they could make themselves more attractive to men and less annoying to their husbands. In doing this, the responsibility for the success or failure of the relationship is placed solely in a woman's hands, asking us to make ourselves small and bend ourselves around the egos and fragile masculinity of the men in our lives. It frames women's lives and concerns as being trivial next to the stresses and burdens of men, and makes women responsible for accommodating them, and encourages us to express gratitude when the men in our lives do the barest of bare minimums. Obviously, this is incredibly dehumanizing, and it sets up heterosexual marriage as being a place of inherent inequality and power imbalances that benefit men and relegate women's lives and emotions and concerns to an inferior position. In her book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, Jane Ward writes that mid-century representations of marriage doubled down on earlier themes of opposite-sex disinterest and resentment by suggesting to women that not only their bodies but also their personalities needed to be carefully managed in order to produce happy heterosexuality. Women's submission and self-sacrifice became central ingredients of straight culture. Straight culture was also marked by men's fragility and irritation, their pervasive sense of burden, loss, and entrapment. The naturalization of women's domestic roles. A 2017 Pew Research Center study found that men are 19% more likely than women to credit nature and biology for women's outsized participation in household labor. The idea that women are somehow more naturally inclined for and equipped to perform domestic labor is pervasive, but there's no actual evidence or science to back it up. As Darcy Lockman points out in her book, All the Rage, Mothers and Fathers and the Myth of Equal Partnership, there is no biological difference between the sexes that explains my husband's failure to download the classroom communications apps requested by our daughter's teachers or to chop the quartered watermelons he regularly brings home and deposits in our refrigerator like an outdoor cat with birdkill on a porch. Women are assumed to possess inherent biological qualities that make us better nurturers, caretakers, and mothers. A gender essentialist view of women is that we're hardwired for connection, whereas men are hardwired for autonomy. This assumption is at the root of a lot of sexist marriage advice that circulated over the past several decades. Human brains, as well as the brains of other primates, are complex and highly developed, and they're also very plastic, meaning that the brain responds to the environment and actually changes its structure based on external external factors. The plasticity of our human brains allows for infinite potentials, so much so that we actually don't rely on reflexes and instincts much at all. Our nervous systems are sophisticated, and they interact with our environment to alter the physical structure of our brains depending on the input that we receive. It's what helps us learn and adapt, but it's also why emotional and psychological trauma can be so damaging. It can actually change our brains on a physical, embodied level. There are still some instincts that we involuntarily perform, like raising our chins and eyebrows at the sight of someone we recognize, but in terms of a larger scope of behaviors and drives, those are shaped more by our culture and environments than by any kind of ingrained biological imperative. Performing domestic labor or acting feminine or being the default parent just because you're a woman isn't a function of biology. It's a learned sociocultural behavior that we can change at any time. But the problem with communicating this is that science is nuanced and often involves a lot of complex intersecting factors that need to be taken into account in order to really understand what's going on. Most people simply don't have the time or energy to engage with these varying levels of complexity, which is why conventional wisdom too often outsells actual scientific data. This is how misinformation gets spread, because conventional wisdom isn't necessarily true or accurate, and it's usually based on a proliferation of stereotypes. This is why books like John Gray's Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus make their way into the popular zeitgeist, even though they're based on faulty and flawed information. But books like Delusions of Gender, The Real Science Behind Sex Differences by neuroscientist Cordelia Fine do not. John Gray's work is based on popular myths about gender stereotypes that don't require us to think too hard, and it reinforces what the dominant culture already jams down our throats from day one, that women are hardwired for housework and men should be coddled and catered to. Sexist men like Harrison Butker like to weaponize this ingrained cultural idea that women are somehow just better at domestic labor and at being a parent, so they can get out of doing work that's perceived as inherently feminine, and so that they can benefit from women's unpaid physical, emotional, and sexual labor. If women are told over and over again from the time we're born that we belong in the home, that we'll be happier and better off there, and that the greatest happiness and honor is to be chosen by a man above all other women, who actually benefits from these messages? When it comes to traditional gender roles, who actually holds the power? The mental load. In Kate Mann's book about entitlement and male privilege, she quoted findings from a study that showed first-time parenthood increased men's workload by 10 hours a week, but it increased women's workload by 20 hours per week. Basically, once a heterosexual couple has a child, women end up doing twice the amount of work as men, regardless of how many additional hours she works outside the home as well. A lot of this work is invisible, and it's referred to as the mental load. The mental load involves not just the physical labor, but the keeping track and anticipatory work that goes into those tasks. The mental load isn't just about doing laundry and going grocery shopping. It's about knowing that Tyler needs his soccer jersey to be clean in time for practice on Thursday, and that we're almost out of baking soda and need to add that to the grocery list. It's about taking ownership of and responsibility for household tasks, not just doing them because they were delegated to you. It also involves managing the feelings of men when it comes to performing these kinds of tasks. Heterosexual women are taught that they shouldn't offend a male partner's ego by daring to point out that he's done a task badly, and that they should avoid asking for too much of his help. It sets up straight women for a life of navigating a complicated catch-22 that puts them in a no-win situation. If they don't ask for their male partners to take on an equitable share of the physical and mental load, they'll be saddled with way more than their fair share of the household labor. But if they do ask, they'll be violating an implied social code that tells them to keep the peace, nurture others, and don't be too demanding. If they are, they face the stigma of being labeled as annoying and a nag. Again, from Kate Mann's book, asking and asking in the right way is an additional layer of labor. Delegating, in many situations, requires repeating requests, which is often perceived as nagging. Sometimes it is simply not worth the effort of asking again and again and continually asking in the right tone and still risk being called a nag. So I do the task myself. A lot of the time, men will weaponize their own incompetence in order to get women to continue to perform domestic labor and to get out of having to do these tasks. I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably know all about weaponized incompetence, and that's like a huge topic that I could probably do a video of all by itself. But like, if you've been on TikTok for 5 minutes, like, You know all about weaponized incompetence. Study after study has shown that though men are taking on significantly more domestic labor than they ever have before, the burden of the mental load is still falling mostly on the women who live with them. What this indicates is that even though men are statistically doing more, they still have to be told to do it, which means all of the work of figuring out what needs to get done and how and when is still falling on women, and that's still labor. In Jane Ward's book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, she states that in the late 20th century, readers consumed the idea that the job duties associated with being a successful wife still included a significant amount of performativity and husband-centered emotional labor, a kind of intensive wifing that mirrored the intensive mothering and child-centeredness popular during the same period. Centering the man's ego and perceived desires was the focal point of marriage advice for decades, and it still looms large in heterosexual culture today, even though by and large men are getting better at pulling their weight at home. It's still not enough though, and as the data has shown, when it comes to marriage, for this reason, women still get the short end of the stick. So who actually benefits from marriage? Taking everything I just talked about into consideration, it should be pretty clear that men benefit from marriage more than women do. The stereotype that all this heterosexual dating advice is based on is that men naturally avoid commitment, but women crave it, and in order to get it, we have to manipulate and entrap men into marriage. Back to the idea of colloquial wisdom versus actual science, this unsurprisingly does not bear out in the data. A 2019 Harvard medical survey of 127,545 American adults found that married men were healthier than men who had never been married or men whose marriages ended in divorce or widowhood. Getting married significantly lowers their risk for developing cardiovascular disease, bringing it down by 46% when compared to unmarried men. Married men also have a lower risk of developing cancer, especially prostate cancer, as well as lower rates of depression and higher rates of life satisfaction. Marriage is also beneficial to men's careers. Another study from 2019 found that married men in the US are more likely than single men to be among the nation's top 1% of earners. Paul Dolan, a professor of behavioral science at the London School of Economics, explained that men benefit more from marriage because they tend to calm down and take less risks. Heterosexual married women, on the other hand, tend to fare less well. I've already talked about how women tend to work harder in relationships than men do, both physically and emotionally, and data from Dolan's study shows that middle-aged married women have an increased risk of both mental and physical health conditions when compared to single women in the same age category. Some studies have shown that women's happiness levels increase right after marriage, but this is likely due to the feeling of accomplishment that comes from aligning with society's expectations. Clearly, this does not continue over time, as women tend to be much less happy and healthy the longer they're married. According to a study done by Dr. Emily Grundy at the University of Essex, women tend to be much more involved in broader social networks, whereas men tend to rely on their wives to fulfill all of their emotional needs. What this means is that while women tend to have diverse social networks and confidants, men have few and lower quality social ties outside of their marriages. This places an additional burden of emotional caretaking on women because patriarchy encourages men not to form close bonds with one another, so they end up turning to their wives in order to fulfill all of their emotional and connection needs. Patriarchy also teaches men that the only way that they can actually have any kind of emotional connection is through sex, and that sex is the only way in which it's okay for men to actually express connection, emotions, and have any kind of intimacy with another human being, which is just sad because there's so many ways to be intimate with someone, and sex is just one of like many of those ways. But patriarchy blinds men to like all the other ways in which they could be developing intimacy with not just other men, but with women in a platonic way as well. Dolan's findings also showed that unmarried women aren't just happier and healthier, they also tend to live longer than married women do, and even married men. It's almost as if when you don't spend your life suppressing your needs and living with the chronic stress of carrying a massively unbalanced physical and emotional burden, you have more time and energy for things like self-care and learning and curiosity and making sure you get enough sleep and live a balanced life and follow your passions. Weird how that works. In a survey of mental health professionals and single child-free women about the benefits of not being tied down, one counselor said, "The biggest benefit to being single and child-free is happiness. Married women with children often express their frustrations in therapy. They express feeling undervalued and unappreciated appreciated. They have sacrificed in both their personal and professional life, caring not only for themselves, but performing the unpaid labor of caring for a husband and children. Although there is the myth of happily ever after in marriage, evidently single women without children are the happiest. Editing Megan here, I realized that I was totally going to include stats in this video on women who are married to other women and compare them to the stats about women who are married to men. I do actually have data on that. I did include that in my research. I just completely forgot to include it in my video because ADHD, it'd be like that sometimes. So maybe what I'll do is a part 2 to this video, and I'll talk about how lesbian and hashtag WLW relationships differ from straight relationships in terms of like the equitable distribution of labor. And that could be an interesting follow-up in terms of a queer feminist perspective. So let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing that, and I can absolutely do that. This isn't strictly scientific, but just anecdotally, I know this to be true looking at the lives of older married women around me. I don't know one woman over the age of 55 who's married to a man and is blissfully, peacefully happy and free from stress-related health issues, especially my mom. When I was growing up, she was always stressed out all the time, balancing the needs of a husband and 3 kids with almost no free time for herself, and she still is just as stressed out as ever, even though all her kids are grown and gone now. I remember wondering as early as 8 years old why she chose to live like that when she could have just never gotten married or had kids and lived instead to pursue her passion. I remember wondering once when I was maybe 15 how I would feel if my mom just ran away one day and left us to go live her life and be free. I spent a good amount of time contemplating that, and I came to the conclusion that while I would have felt really sad and traumatized for sure, and I would have missed her like so much, a part of me would have also felt happy for her that she got to escape and go find herself. And it wasn't just my mom. All the mothers whose kids she looked after during the day would show up at our front door in tears so many times, overwhelmed and burned out and stressing about their husbands being jerks or their kids being uncooperative. And I would just think to myself, this looks so miserable. Why are women doing this to themselves? Turns out I'm actually queer, so the skepticism with which I've always viewed heterosexual marriage and motherhood probably has something to do with that. A queer feminist perspective on heterosexual marriage. Queer women sometimes view straight couples with our eyebrows raised, and not in like a pitying, superior, we feel sorry for all you straight women way. Okay, maybe there's like a little bit of that sometimes, but just amongst ourselves, I promise. There's nothing wrong with being straight at all. Straight people were born that way and they just can't help it. We know, we get that. What we're skeptical of is heterosexual culture, not of like being straight in and of itself. Not that queer relationships can't be toxic sometimes too. They absolutely can. Queer people cheat and lie all the time, just as much as straight people do. I'm not giving you a pass for that. That's just a fact. However, the difference is that heterosexual marriage seems to be set up to fail right from the start, and that's because of everything I just talked about in terms of gender roles and toxic marriage advice. There's this underlying antagonism between straight men and women, and it sets up heterosexual relationships as a battleground in which game-playing, manipulation tactics, and martyrdom are all advised and celebrated. That does not exist in queer culture. Straight culture naturalizes and glorifies men's failures and women's suffering, reducing both to gender stereotypes that are marketed as being natural and just the way it is. Men are useless and incompetent when it comes to household and parenting, and women are annoying nags whose job it is to tiptoe around their husbands' egos and try to not scare them away. Straight culture is also really myopic when it comes to all of the colorful and creative ways that human beings can relate to one another and have sex and express themselves and play with gender. One thing that personally frustrates me a lot is the reduction of queer people to our sexual preferences and orientations, because being queer is so much more than that. A lot of queer people don't even have sex at all. Shout out to all my sex-averse asexual brothers and sisters. Being queer is simply being open to experience, to loving who you love, to expressing gender in authentic ways rather than performing it for others, to being creative and colorful, to building community, to prioritizing all of your relationships equally. I say I love you to my friends just as often as I say it to my girlfriend, and I mean it just as deeply. Being queer is about fluidity, about not getting stuck into rigid identities and ways of being. In The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, author Jane Ward interviewed a diverse group of queer people to get their perspectives on straight culture. One queer woman summed it up perfectly. What makes me sad and what seems to be a hallmark of straight culture is the individual buy-in to the idea that women have no other options than settling for disappointing romantic, sexual, everything relationships. It feels like your whole life path is scripted in straight culture. I think I would feel so hopeless and sad and bored and unexcited and trapped. It seems like straight culture grooms you to be a better tool of capitalism by accepting ways of living that are boring and exhausting without question. A lot of rituals of straight culture can also seem strange and unhealthy to queer people. A big head scratcher for me has always been gender reveal parties because, first of all, why are we celebrating the biological genitalia of an unborn child? And second of all, why are we assigning gender to an infant in the first place? I struggle to buy things for my nieces sometimes because it feels weird and icky to me to reinforce a baby's assigned gender, so I just end up going for the most gender neutral things that I can find. When you're queer, feeling forced to participate in these rituals of heterosexuality can feel exhausting and alienating sometimes. One of Jane Ward's respondents said, "The hysteria around straight weddings is very off-putting. It feels very superficial with the pageantry of it all, even with the events that lead up to it. For example, the engagement picture where the couple is in a random field, meadow, open land. Maybe it's symbolic?" Way back when, another lifetime ago, when I was planning my own straight wedding, I remember feeling really weird about all the rituals around it and being very adamant that I didn't want anything to do with them. Our engagement party was just a quiet dinner at a restaurant with our closest friends and family, and I very much did not want a wedding shower, an engagement photo shoot, a bachelorette, or any of those traditional wedding events. My ex and I ended up eloping, and that felt a lot more authentic. There was just something about all those rituals that felt hollow and performative, and they didn't mean anything to me. For a long time after my marriage ended, I thought that I would never be interested in marriage again because the whole thing just felt inauthentic and devoid of any actual intimacy or celebration. And it would have been if I'd remained in the closet. But since coming out, I'm realizing that a lot of my antagonism towards the institution of marriage was really about not wanting to be in a heterosexual marriage with all of the implied gender performance and rigid roles and statistically terrible health and happiness outcomes. I'm still not dying to get married or anything, and I never will be. And I'm realizing that the feeling of needing to get married is also very much a part of straight culture because the dominant culture expects that of women and instills fear and panic if and when we choose to ignore those expectations. But now that I've stepped outside of that straight culture and I can see it more clearly for what it is, that fear and panic and need to get married is being reframed as a function of straight culture and not actually inherent or integral to me and who I am as a human being. Doing dishes really is sexy. One of the most famous stereotypes about straight women in heterosexual marriages is that they tend to lose interest in sex over time. There's a bevy of marriage advice aimed at both men and women for how they can fix this problem, and a lot of research has been done to determine the cause of this. But any straight woman who's been married to or cohabitating with a man for more than a few years probably doesn't need academics to explain this phenomenon. A March 2023 survey on the blog Liberating Motherhood asked women readers why they're most likely to say no to sex, and 63.41% responded that it was because their male partners don't do their fair share around the house. This response came in second from the top, with the topmost answer being simply "I'm tired" at 82.93%. Which begs the question, why are women in heterosexual marriages so tired? I think we know why. Research has shown that when male partners aren't pulling their weight at home, women start to view them as yet another child rather than as an equal adult partner, and obviously this would have dire consequences for a woman's sex drive. No one wants to get naked with someone they view as a child and as a dependent. Men pulling their weight, both in terms of actual household responsibilities and in terms of the mental load, will go a long way towards repairing some of the divides in heterosexual relationships. Men also learning to connect in intimate, non-sexual ways with other men and platonically with women will also go a long way towards relieving women of a lot of the burdens of having to perform unpaid emotional labor for their husbands. Patriarchy instills a lot of hang-ups in men when it comes to relying on other men for emotional support and intimacy, and actively unlearning that shit would provide a lot of relief for everyone, including us baffled queers who are over here wondering all the time if the straights are okay.
I think this whole trope of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, straight relationships being a mother and a child is really weird and inappropriate.
All humans are hardwired for connection, not just women. Men need it just as much, and the sooner they realize that and start unlearning all their internalized misogyny and setting aside their fragile patriarchal masculinity, the better off they'll be. Our friend Harrison Butker is tragically unaware of this, and even more tragically, his wife will be the one who suffers for it the most. As I've hopefully proven with this video, his pronouncements about women's true calling in marriage and motherhood are not only sexist, they're just scientifically incorrect and not actually based in anything objectively real. And I'm so happy to see just how much of a backlash there was after his commencement speech, because it shows just how much straight women are done with men who think like him, and I am here for it.
You can tell it's all paternalistic, predatory bullshit, because if these men truly believed what's best for society and best for women is that women are just wives and mothers and nothing else, they would advocate for things that make that more possible. They don't advocate for universal health care that's not tied to your employment outside of the home. They don't advocate for universal basic income for stay-at-home caregivers or some type of retirement system for stay-at-home caregivers. They don't advocate for affordable housing so more people can afford to live on one income so their wife can stay home and just take care of the kids, because it's all bullshit. Because they don't care about you getting to stay home. They care about you not being able to leave home and leave them. Like, no one talks this way about single mothers. No one says about a single mother who just stays home and parents her kid all day and doesn't have an income outside of the home, oh, she's doing what's best. She's doing what she's supposed to be doing. No, they call her like lazy and a terrible mother, because it's not about being a mother is the most important thing. It's being dependent on a man is the most important thing. Like, oh, your entire belief system is just that the only way women can be fulfilled in their lives is to just be a wife and a mother, two incredibly labor-intensive, unpaid jobs that make you completely dependent on the person that made you a wife and a mother, and requires you to keep the person that made you a wife and a mother interested in keeping you around to have your basic needs met. Interesting.
Straight women, your queer sister is here for you every step of the way. That's going to do it, my loves. Thank you for sitting through all of this, and I hope that you learned something, got something out of it, or just felt seen if you are a straight woman struggling in a heterosexual marriage right now. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this kind of content, and I'll see you in the next one. Toodaloo. Thank you.